Hi guys, welcome to our first ever episode of the Betterment podcast, the pursuit of infinite growth. I'm pretty pumped. This is just meant to be like an intro episode, so we won't cover too much today. A couple of things we will cover. It's kind of where I've been, what's been going on, why the changes now. But I'm really excited to get into this podcast. It's been about a year and a half since I've done it, so I appreciate all the support from people following on Instagram, anyone that's listening to this or watching this on YouTube. Means a lot to me. So I'm stoked. It's going to be a great podcast. I have a lot of planned in store for us. So first thing I kind of want to get into is like, why was I gone so long from the podcast? It's been about a year and a half or so since the last time I even recorded an episode. And honestly, the first thing was work. When I first moved down to San Diego, obviously transitioning from my other company to Sunrun, where I do door-to-door sales, that was kind of my priority. And to be honest, getting out of Chico was nice. And so going to the beaches, golfing, the priority of podcasting just kind of fizzled out. I think I did like 3 or 4 episodes when I first came to San Diego, but over time, I just was like, I didn't really feel that there was much purpose, right? I also didn't really feel like there was much to talk about. I mean, obviously I just graduated and whatnot, but there wasn't anything new going on in my life. Both relationship, monetary, besides the fact of me moving to San Diego, obviously, there wasn't like a whole lot going on that I felt added value. And it's actually part of the reason why I decided to, why the second question is kind of like, why did I decide to restart everything and build a new podcast? Hilarious Society was all about like my college life. If you guys go back to my first episode, right, it's me and John talking about, Tinder and pickup lines and, jail stories. Not me, but some of the homies. And just a very like frat boy college kind of podcast. It obviously grew into something that was a lot more deep and sustainable with the conversations that I started to have later on in the podcast. But the name Hilarious Society had nothing to do with the topic towards the end of it. And I feel this name much more clearly aligns with what we're talking about, right? The Betterment podcast. It's all about bettering yourself, pursuing what you find meaningful, growth, going for the opportunity, taking the risk, and just getting like 1% better every day, right? The reason why I chose this name is there was about 30 or 40 names that I was thinking about picking from that I came up with. I asked a lot of my close friends and family, so anyone that gave me advice, I appreciate it. I took all of them into consideration. But the Betterment podcast stands out to me because it's simple, but it also is very clear to understand, right? Betterment, to get better, right? To improve daily, weekly, monthly. And what we're going to be talking about on here is a multitude of things, right? It's not just, self-development. It's not just fitness. It's not just philosophy or, book recommendations. It's going to be a mixture of a lot of things, all in the element of betterment. So things that are positive. I won't be talking about gambling. I used to talk about gambling on my other podcast, or girls. I'm in love now. Who would have thought? Shout out to my girlfriend, Sarah. I love you, babe. And she's been a huge support as well, actually, for me growing this podcast. But I'm not going to be talking about like vices and whatnot. Maybe I'll do a separate podcast for that down the road, because at the end of the day, everybody knows I'm a guy's guy. But as I've gotten older, I've matured a lot as well. And that's what you'll kind of come to find on this podcast, is we're talking about deep, insightful questions as to why we do what we do, what are we trying to improve on, what areas of our life are we all struggling at that, we can take some advice. And I'm obviously not going to do this podcast alone. I am the host of it, but we're going to have a lot of special guests that I already have lined up that I'm really looking forward to doing that with. So that's a little bit about the podcast and why it clearly aligns. I think this podcast clearly aligns with the goals and ideas that Hilarious Society started to push towards, but it's a completely different chapter in my life. I think I've had a lot of perspective happen in the last 18 months, which in the following episodes I'll kind of go over. But there's been a lot of changes for the better, and just differences as you grow up in life. Things change, financially, romantically, career-wise. Things change. and I wanted to start to kind of bring that to light. And also too, the main reason why is I want to start documenting my life again. One thing that I was really proud of myself, as crazy as I was in Chico, for all of you guys that remember, with the vlogs and the podcast, is that I was documenting my life. And I know that one day I will be very successful, and that I will look back and be proud of the man I became and the people I helped and the difference I made in whatever aspect that is. But I need to start documenting that, because there's been a nice chunk of time that I haven't documented publicly. I'm always recording myself, probably once a month, maybe twice a month, on what's going on with my life. And more than anything, I'm doing this podcast for me so that I can look back in my life and figure out when I was doing things right, when I was doing things wrong, and almost like a library for Nick, right? So that's kind of what I'm looking forward to the most, and why I decided to restart this podcast. What's kind of the purpose or the theme? I kind of talked about that, but it's to inspire daily growth as individuals, which we can then obviously, trickle down and spread to groups or the masses. It's to push limits on what is possible, right? Whether that's, studying an extra hour, running an extra mile at the gym, calling one more customer, whatever it is, pushing yourself outside your comfort zone. The other reason why I am excited about doing this podcast is I'm putting myself out there, right? I know that in recent years, I've had, dips and troughs, like everybody, highs and lows, where I'm super motivated, and more than motivated, discipline, because discipline will always outlast motivation. But I'm extremely focused, and then I go bananas for a week or two, right? And I just kind of let go, and I go all out the other direction. I think by me being on this podcast and kind of spearheading, hopefully, a movement of betterment, I'm going to keep myself more aligned, and I have people looking at me or watching me constantly with this kind of podcast and being public, that I think it's just going to make me more accountable for myself. Now, I think it's very important to know you should do anything that you do in this life for you. Don't do it for anybody else. However, if those values are in alignment with bettering oneself or growing, I think it is good to be accountable and to let others know. Just because you have a little bit more pressure, or more of a obligation to those around you. So yeah, it's to inspire growth as individuals, to push limits on what's possible, to bring uncomfortable conversations that need to be addressed. This isn't a political podcast by any means, but I'm sure in some way, shape, or form, something might pop up. There's also more uncomfortable conversations I'm talking more about is, the things that we're letting ourselves down with daily. I struggle with my own vices. No one's perfect. I always say that on my last podcast. I'm not a monk. But I do try to strive to get better daily. And there are things that I can be doing right now, and I'm trying to eliminate to get better. Everybody has those, but most people don't want to call you out for those. A true friend pulls you aside and says, hey, you need to get your shit together. Which actually brings me to my next little side point. I used to cuss a lot. I still do. I do think there's actual strength and power in cussing. It's just at the right times. Before, I would swear like a sailor on the last podcast, and I think some of the messages almost lost value because, one, I was talking very fast. As you guys know, I love this. When I'm excited or passionate about something, I speak very quickly. But two, it almost kind of diluted the message because I was just swearing left and right. It was almost ignorance at that point. And then the last thing I would say is obviously to be a better version of yourself. Now, I know that's very cliche and that can mean many different things. What you'll come to find in this podcast is we're going to define those into a more clear and concise way of what betterment means for oneself. Everybody has different things that they value, different things that they struggle with, and different things that they're trying to achieve. Because of that, this podcast is trying to jumble all those thoughts and ideas together into one succinct and concise kind of podcast where we can kind of bring it all into one big bow and tie it together and specify in a way that's going to reach a large majority of the audience while still staying on track with the overall alignment of this podcast. And when and where can you expect to find this podcast? It's a great question. It's going to be on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, just like the other podcast was before. Those three platforms seem to be where I can release them. Obviously, I promote heavily on Instagram, and there is a Instagram account you guys can follow called _Betterment podcast. We're growing at a rapid rate. I think we're almost at 100 people, so don't be a fan later. But yeah, as far as listening or watching, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. I'm an Apple guy, but I know a lot of people like Spotify, so got to reach the masses. And then how often? A minimum of once a week, typically shooting for Mondays ideally. Now, I'm going to drop this one on Saturday because, once again, accountability. I told everybody I would drop the first podcast today. I think Mondays would be ideal because it's the beginning of the week. It's new ideas, it's new thoughts, it's a new perspective or training to go out and try in your life for the week. That's the idea. I'm not sure. We're going to shoot for Mondays. I'm going to commit to Mondays at least for the first 4 weeks, and then after that, we'll see where it goes. How does this podcast differ from the Hilarious Society podcast I had? So I kind of touched on this briefly, but it's more focused on self-development from an adult/career perspective, right? Actually, everything but the last 3 or 4 episodes that I posted about with Hilarious Society, my prior podcast, was all focused on perspective as a college student, which I was, so there's nothing wrong with that. However, I was at Chico State, I was in a small town, I was working for a different company, I was single. My thought process has changed. Everything changes in life, There's a great coach, my old coach Hardy used to say, which is the only thing that will ever be consistent in life is change. So let that one sink in for a second. But because my perspective has changed and I'm in a different environment, I live in a different city, I'm dating a girl now, or I'm in a relationship with my girlfriend, job, career, which I'll cover in the upcoming podcast. There's been a lot of changes, and I wanted to go ahead and share it from a different perspective. It's like a different chapter in Nick's life. And who knows, maybe in 10 years from now I start a new podcast. It's about my 30s or whatnot. But as of now, I think this is a great time to flip the page and start a brand new podcast, and a brand new perspective on life and betterment. The next thing is, that it differs from the prior podcast, is it's going to be covering a lot more select range of topics. Hilarious Society was, gambling, girls, women, motivation, spirituality, politics, or whatever. It was all over the place. This one's going to be a lot more focused on the idea or kind of cloud of betterment and anything that falls under that category, which can be self-development, philosophy, fitness, pushing through the struggle, perspectives on nutrition. But I don't, like I said before, I'm not really going to focus on like gambling or vices, because it kind of defeats the purpose of the podcast of getting better, right? We're not trying to have the Worserman podcast. It's a dad joke. Sorry, that's stupid. I'm gonna have fun still though. Definitely gonna have fun still. The other thing is, it's not going to be heavily comedy focused. So of course, you guys know me. I love to be comical. In fact, I would say I'm a pretty spastic or can be funny guy. But I do want to spend time on this podcast particularly and primarily to focus on more serious or just thought-provoking conversations. I'm still going to have fun. I'm not going to be, some like robot staring at the camera with no emotion. But I do think that having a focus that's a little bit more on the reality of what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is ultimately, as I said before, right, the pursuit of infinite growth. The reason why I love that slogan is it's a pursuit, right? We'll talk about this in the next or upcoming podcast, but quick book recommendation. There's a book by Simon Sinek called The Game. That should be right, but correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And he talks about the infinite game and the finite game. I talk about this all of the time because it's such a good perspective on life. In infinite game, right, there are known and unknown players, and the only point of the game is to keep the game going. In a finite game, think of it as like basketball or football, right? There's known players, and there's a set amount of time before the game ends. It's finite, meaning, right, there's only a certain amount of time until it's over. Well, there's a lot of infinite games in life that we don't talk about, such as marriage or relationships or fitness, right? You don't go to the gym one day and then you don't have to work out ever again. It's something that you have to continuously do. It's a continuous pursuit. So I really like that because it resonates well with the podcast slogan, which is the pursuit of infinite growth. And if you notice on the logo of the Betterment podcast, it's a rocket propelling into the sky, which I love. But also, if you pay close attention below, there is an infinity sign that is propelling off the rocket, meaning that it's an infinite pursuit. Kind of cool idea, I know. I spent way too much time figuring out which logo I was going to use. But I hope you guys like that and appreciate it. And then the final thing is we're going to do more research on topics and in-depth conversations. Yes, it's good to sometimes come out here and free ball and throw shit against the wall and see what sticks. But I think there's a lot of value in doing research prior and giving you guys, my audience, the best podcast that I can, which is the most research before I talk about anything, whether it's nutrition or fitness, and bring up studies. I'm a big Andrew Huberman Labs guy. Love Andrew Huberman. I love Joe Rogan. I listen to a couple others. But that is basically all I got for this podcast, guys. I really, really, really appreciate all the support I've already felt. I know I'm a truly blessed and loved individual. I have a lot of gratitude for the people in my life, and shout out my boy God upstairs. And so I really appreciate you guys checking out this first episode. We're going to start dropping them every Monday. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your boss, tell whoever you think can get a little bit better. So with that, guys, I want to say I appreciate your guys' time. Happy Saturday. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, and I will see you guys on the next episode.